Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Durrant from the IRENA team here in Bonn. Sami unfortunately can't join us today, but she is on the line, so taking time out from her leave to join us. Welcome. I'm going to do quite a quick introduction because our first speaker of the morning has limited time, so I'm keen that we get to him. But let me just give you a little bit of context. I think pretty much everybody knows this by now, but this is the latest in a series of webinars as part of the long-term energy scenarios campaign. So this is a campaign that IRENA is running under the leadership of Germany and Denmark, and as part of our wider work to engage people in modeling and long-term energy scenarios. We're particularly focused on three themes: the use of scenarios in the political process, providing guidance on that, improving scenarios and modeling tools to reflect emerging factors and wider societal issues, and building scenario creating capacity in various governments and institutions. So this will be the last of a series in 2019, but 2018, but we will continue in 2019. We have two speakers for you today. The first is Hiroyuki Ishida, who is the Deputy Manager in the Energy Strategy Office, Policy Planning and Coordination Division of the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy as part of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry in Japan. And then our second speaker is Paul Koutstaal, who's the Senior Scientific Researcher and Deputy Department Head in PBL in the Netherlands, the Environment Assessment Agency. So as usual, the format is about 15 minutes of presentation. You have the opportunity to ask questions as we're going along. You can do so through the question feature in the webinar interface. Please do post your questions there as we go. Unfortunately, because Hiroyuki has limited time, he may not be able to answer the questions live, but we'll capture those, email them through, and he can always respond by email afterwards. When we get to Paul, hopefully we'll be able to answer at least some of the questions live. Apologies in advance if we can't get through all of them, but we can always follow up offline afterwards. You'll all be muted throughout the call, so I'm afraid your only way of communicating to us is through either the question feature to post questions, or if you have a question of us as the organizer or a technical issue, you can use the chat function. I hope that's all clear. There should be handouts of the presentations in the handouts section of the interface. We'll check that in a moment. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Hiroyuki to give you his presentation. Hiroyuki, can you go ahead?
Hi. Okay, thank you for the introduction. I'm Hiroyuki Ishida from Japan, and I'll make a presentation about multi-scenario approach for long-term energy transition in Japanese energy plan. And unfortunately, because of the system problem in my office, I'm just talking via my mobile now, without seeing the slide you are seeing in the webinar platform page. This presentation style, it's like a little bit strange feeling, but IRENA will operate the slide in line with my presentation. Thank you. So let's start from the highlight of energy policy plan in Japan. So page 1, please. Okay. So in Japan, as most upstream energy policy, we have a strategic energy plan, which is based on a law called Basic Act on Energy Policy, and which is revised every 3 or 4 years. And this year, in July, 5th strategic plan, which has perspectives for both energy mix 2030 and the scenarios for 2050, was drawn up. So for the presentation today, a story about 2050 is more relevant. But please go to the slide second, please. Okay. Before going to 2050, I'll give you a brief overview of 2030 energy mix in Japan. Firstly, our fundamental principle in energy policy is called 3+S, which means energy security, economic efficiency, environment, and safety. So based on this principle, demand and supply structure in 2030 was drawn up with bottom-up approach. So look at the right figure. So the most right boxes in the right figure shows total primary energy supply and the power consumption in 2030. This energy mix is actually a vision to be realized, so it's not like a scenario analysis. And then, please move to slide 3. Okay, so 2030 target is like left figure in this page. We express as a straight line effort with carrying out like PDCA cycle. On the other hand, 2050 is far distant from now, so different approach is needed to deal with huge uncertainty. So, and since the target in 2050 is very ambitious, we stress the importance of multi-track scenario and technical innovations, like the image in the right figure. Okay, so please move on to the page 4. And this figure shows just an example of decarbonized technologies across the sector, electric power and industries and transportation. So I don't really have time today, so I don't explain the details in this figure. But since most of the technologies written here are not actually mature enough for the practical use, so competition among technology is very important, we think. So it means we can't select our one promising technology so far. So we'll better follow all possibilities widely. And so each system itself or a combination of the system we think we can call the scenarios. Okay, so this is what in our mind. And then go to page 5, please. And then more concretely, I'll show you the basic idea of quantitative analysis of scenarios in power sector. So actually, conventional cost analysis for power sector is evaluation of each power source respectively, like coal or LNG or solar power or wind itself, like using LCOE approach, but with decarbonized system, we need to evaluate the cost as a whole system. So for system, we can draw up, for example, like renewable plus storage batteries or renewables plus hydrogen. It's like power to gas to power, though it looks a bit inefficient today. And fossil fuel plus CCS or nuclear power, or possibly renewables plus demand response with digital system. So we, when we can assess the cost of these systems, and then when we have benchmark cost, then the difference will be the cost reduction target in future for the system. And okay, so please go to the page 6. And then to quantify the system cost, we need to specify the energy flows. For example, in this figure shows renewable plus battery or renewable plus hydrogen and some CCS system. And this figure looks very complicated, so and there's no long time, so I don't explain it in detail. But for each energy flow component, we assume current cost somehow and calculate the cost per kilowatt hour of the power for each system with simplified assumption, like that we meet all electricity demand with the one system. And we know this kind of assumption very extreme, but it is just for our first try. Okay, so move to the page 7, please. Please look at the lower left figures, and that's showing the result of our simplified calculations. So looking at the nuclear power, current cost is around 10 yen per kilowatt hour. And for your information, 1 euro nearly equal to 130 yen. And the next right, the orange bars, hydrogen and methanation, fossil fuel gasification plus CCS scenarios, whose costs are up to 200 and 130 with current technologies. And right, the green bars are renewable scenario with battery storage and hydrogen, whose costs are up to 160 for each. So I can't explain the detail in the calculation, but what I want to say is, the detailed calculation is, I think it is not the scope of this webinar. But what I like to stress is this calculation shows all systems are currently very expensive, so that we need to track and review the progress in each technology constantly. So yeah, this is very short, but this is how we apply the scenario analysis to the long-term energy plan in Japan. And actually, that's all on my presentation today. So thank you very much. And unfortunately, I can't see the postpone of the webinar, and I have next meeting soon. So if you have questions, please send it via email. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiroyuki. My apologies, Hiroyuki. That was very interesting. So colleagues on the line, as you've just heard, unfortunately, Hiroyuki has to dash, but we happily can receive questions from you either through the messaging questions feature in the webinar app, or you could drop an email to the usual contacts at IRENA, and we will pass those questions on. So I'm not seeing any immediate urgent questions right now. So in that case, we will move on to our second speaker, which is Paul Koutstaal from PBL Netherlands. So Paul, can we ask you to give your presentation, and then afterwards there's an opportunity for questions. Do post them on the webinar interface as you're going. Over to you, Paul.
Yes, thank you very much. Welcome to everybody. Good morning here in the Netherlands. I'm going to talk a bit less about the details of our modeling, but more about the role that our modeling has in Dutch energy policy. Next slide, please. So that's the first. First of all, I will talk about the Dutch policy environment to give you an idea what this environment looks like, how we do climate and energy policy in the Netherlands, and what the role of scenario analysis is that. And then I will move on to more the modeling challenges we are facing at the moment. As you can see on the slide, Dutch policy environment. First of all, European Union policies are quite important for the Dutch policy. There are a lot of regulations and directives which are made at the EU level, and there are also targets on renewable energy, targets on energy efficiency, and of course targets on CO2 emission reduction. But next to that, there are also policies made at the Dutch level. For example, policies to meet those targets. There are a couple of ministries, the government ministries involved. The most important one is Economic Affairs and Climate. And next to that, we have the Ministry of the Interior, which looks at air quality, and the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, which is also looking at air quality and built environment. Particular and specific element in Dutch energy and climate policy is that we try to reach agreements with a broad range of stakeholders. We have had an energy agreement in 2013, and these broad range of stakeholders include firms, business associations, network operators, NGOs, such as environmental NGOs, Greenpeace, etc., and ministries and local government. And the idea of these energy agreements, this kind of agreements, is to get a broad acceptance and support from all parts of society in the Netherlands for energy policy. As I said, there was an energy agreement concluded in 2013, which sets targets for energy efficiency, renewable energy. And currently we are talking about a climate agreement. Negotiations are ongoing as I speak, and they need to be finished tomorrow. And that will set, that is looking especially at 2030. In the former presentation, there was more talk about 2050. In the Netherlands, the focus is very much on the shorter term, on 2030. So I will focus on that and the role of scenario analysis in the process. Sometimes we do studies for 2050, but in the policy arena, they play less of a role. Next slide, please. The current climate agreement negotiations that are ongoing and to be concluded this week, they look at 2030, and there is a clear target of 49% emission reduction in 2030 relative to the 1990 emissions. And this emission reduction target is allocated, parts of it, to 5 different tables in which the talks take place with all kinds of stakeholders. As I said, industry, NGOs, representatives from households, etc. And those tables are electricity, industry, transport, built environment, and agriculture. Next to the 49% emission reduction, there's also talk about reaching 55% reduction in 2030, but that will only be the case if other countries within the European Union also move towards comparable targets. Now, coming to the part of scenarios, PBL, the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, of which I'm a part, is providing the underlying studies to calculate whether proposed measures, etc., will reach the targets. And we have also provided the baseline scenario to 2030, which is part, which will be used to evaluate whether the additional measures and policies will have an effect. Next slide, please. And PBL, it is the so-called Knowledge Institute of the Dutch government for environmental issues, spatial planning, and sustainable development. And within the climate, air, and energy sector, we do a lot of national studies in which we analyze EU and government policies and those agreements like the climate agreement. We look at emissions, energy use, renewable energy, at the costs. And there is another knowledge institute, the Economic Policy Analysis group, which analyzes economic consequences. Next to that, but I won't dwell on that anymore, the rest of my presentation, there is also an international part, the PBL, which does studies for the IPCC and the European Commission. Next slide, please. Now, the most important study we do, in principle, every year for the Dutch government, scenario study, is the Dutch National Energy Outlook. This provides the realizations and projections for energy use and emissions in the Netherlands up to 2030 to 35. In order to do this study, we have a modeling suite with a large number of different models, both models for supply sectors in the energy system and demand models. And just to give a few examples, we have a European electricity market model. If you want to say something about electricity use in the Netherlands, you have to look at the wider picture because we have one integrated energy market in Europe, certainly in the northwest of Europe. But we also have models for example, the development and electricity use of electrical appliances with households, but also for industry, for the role of CHP, a whole bunch of models in order to be able to model the Dutch energy system, where necessary the European energy system, quite a lot of detail. Now, in this National Energy Outlook, we basically look at 2 different scenarios. One is that the actual policies and measures that are in force and which are law, but we also look at policies and measures of which it is sure that they will be implemented within short periods. We do get input from governments and others on how the policies have been designed, to give us more information on that. But in the end, the assessment of the impact of those policies, whether with these policies we will reach targets as set, for example, the energy agreement, that's the sole responsibility of the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, PVL. Next slide, please. One very interesting feature of our studies is that we only use one background scenario for the international developments abroad, and future fuel and CO2 prices. We do have sensitivity analysis in addition to that, because certainly for the longer run up to 2030, I think only one background scenario is quite limited. And therefore we do this sensitivity analysis, but this causes some problems in discussions with the government. I will come back to that later. Based on the results we get from this National Energy Outlook, it's up to the government to come up with policy adjustments and new policies. For example, if those targets specified in the energy agreement for renewable energy or for energy efficiency are not met, then they have to come up with additional policies. And sometimes specific policies that have been put into place turn out not to be very effective, which also calls for changes in policies and measures. As I already said, we do this one background scenario with the sensitivity analysis. But what you see is that the government always focuses on this one outcome of this one scenario, which both implemented and intended policies, and they tend not to look as much at the range of outcomes, which obviously is there for 2030. And it's really a challenge for them to deal with the uncertainties which are part of our sensitivity analysis, and with the uncertainties of changing international circumstances. Just to mention an example, the Dutch electricity sector is very much integrated in the rest of Europe. So changes in market conditions, in fuel prices, will have a big impact on electricity generation in the Netherlands, and therefore on CO2 emissions in the Netherlands. And it's difficult for the government to accept that from one year to another, if circumstances change, and that also outcomes change. So that might be something for the discussion. How do you do that in other countries? As regards the future, the Dutch National Energy Outlook, there's currently in Parliament the discussion of a climate law, in which sets a greenhouse gas reduction target for 2050 of 95%. And in that law, there is a special role for this National Energy Outlook, which we make every year, to monitor progress towards this target. And that can then also be a reason to adjust policies or not. Next slide, please. Now moving on towards the modeling challenges. As I said, we have this whole suite of different models for supply, demand. I think a major challenge in the years ahead is to take into account system integration. To now, gas, heat, power, and demand in different sectors was rather independent to some extent. But what you will see in the future, if you get more wind and solar in the energy system, that there will be much more interactions between gas, heat, and power. Demand response, for example, for electricity, will become much more important. Power consumption will start reacting to the more volatile prices on markets. Hydrogen might come into the picture, certainly in the longer run, beyond 2030. But it can also have an impact on the relations between gas, heat, and power. We looked at 2030 as part of an exercise for this ongoing climate agreement, and there we included power to heat in industry in our electricity market model, where heat was provided either from gas boilers or electrical boilers, depending on relative prices. We also took into account smart loading of electrical vehicles. These are examples of the way in which the energy system will be changing, with more integration within the whole system. And we have to take that into account in our model. So that's something we really will be looking at in the future years. Another important aspect that's coming to the fore in the discussions in the Netherlands is the impact of energy and climate policies on income distribution. And what you will see is that it becomes more important. Climate and energy policy, it also will have bigger effects on costs, but certainly it will also have distributional effects. And we've seen the protests in France over increased fuel prices. We haven't moved that far yet, but there's a lot of discussion in the Netherlands, and that's something that we will also have to provide more information on in our modeling. And another one is modeling regional and local policies and measures. Part of realizing targets for example, energy efficiency in the built environment and for renewable energy will be done at a regional and local level. So we also have to be able to monitor that and to model that in our analysis. Next slide, please. And then moving on to more specific sectors, what do we have to look at in our modeling? I think for industry, it's electrification and new processes, for example, using hydrogen and steel production, that we will have to be included in the longer run. District heating will become much more important, probably in providing heat to the built environment. That's something that will need more detail. In the electricity sector, developments like decentralized power generation by solar PV, for example, and the role of renewables. Up to now, renewables, investments in renewables was very much driven by subsidies. In the future, it will also be to a larger extent driven by market forces. We will see market-driven endogenous investments. That's also something on which we are working on to include that in our modeling. And lastly, infrastructure will become more important, exchange between electricity and gas, with power to gas options. What do we do with the gas network? It's becoming older and older and has to be renewed or not. What are the optimal network extensions? And what are the investment costs? So that are examples of the kind of things that in long-term scenario studies you will need to take into account in your modeling efforts. Next slide, please. And finally, the last subject, and that's something that is also coming to the fore given the greater importance of climate policies, is transparency and the legitimacy of the modeling tools we use. As I said, there's a mounting importance and impact of energy policies. You will see that in changes in energy use, households might have to move from using gas, which is used a lot in the Netherlands, towards electrical or district heating and electrical cooking. That can have quite an impact on houses, the need for refurbishments in order to be able to move to electrical heating with heat pumps. And there will be cost and a distributional effect that you have to take into account. What we see happening in the Netherlands, that might also be the case in other countries, that people are looking much more closely at our studies and outcomes. Stakeholders, government, parliament, they compared to a couple of years ago, there was some attention for what we did, but now there's really very close attention. People looking in much detail at the costs that come out of it, at the effects on emissions, and that means that we have to be more transparent about how we do our analysis. As regards our models, we are working on getting more descriptions, making them possibly open source, to have reviews, either in peer-reviewed articles or specific review processes. We also want to be much more transparent about our input data, make them public accessible, in order for all the stakeholders and other parties to be able to have a good understanding of what we are doing and why we are doing certain things, and so that it's clear how we arrive at our results. And lastly, we are also involving stakeholders more while we are doing our studies and after our studies, in order to increase the understanding of the way we do our modeling. Next slide, please. And thank you for your attention. Back to you at the arena.
Sorry, I realised my microphone's not in the right place. Thank you very much. That's very clear and informative. We have a few questions which are on the system, which I'll read out to you. If anybody has any additional questions, do please post them in the next few minutes. So the first one, it's a relatively long question, Paul, so bear with me. Are the models from the modelling suite linked somehow? For example, from the European market modelling, you might get the time series or prices that will influence the electrical appliances model, also the other way around. How do you consider the effect of CHP, heat pumps, etc. in the price of electricity? Do you add it in the EU market model or do you do something else? Hope that was clear. Did you follow that?
Just to mute my microphone. That's a good question. It's also certainly a very important issue. We do have different models, for example, for CHP and industry, and it's not part of our electricity market model, but the way we integrate it is that we iterate between those models, and also with the renewable energy model, and we iterate until prices converge. And in that sense, we take into account the effect of prices. It's also something we do with demand in other sectors, although they might be less price sensitive. Electricity is lower, for example, in households, but there we also take into account the effect of electricity prices by having one or two iterations.
Okay, thank you. I think that gives us some insights. A different question. Can you give us some more details about your studies on the impact of energy and climate policies on income distribution?
As I said, that's one of our modeling challenges, and we have done some preliminary analysis of that. First of all, what you see is that mostly energy and climate policies tend to be quite aggressive, and the costs fall to a large extent relatively more on the lower income groups within the society. So that's a well-known result also from earlier study of energy poverty. I think an important message there is that if you have energy and climate policies which have such an effect on income distribution, you should also have linking policies to mitigate these kind of effects. Probably, and that's also one of the main messages we get out.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Many modelling challenges were mentioned. Do you feel the currently available suite of tools can adequately respond to these challenges? What needs to be improved in the modelling tools?
I think so far we are okay. Given the extent of system integration we see up till now, that certainly up towards 2030, that's fairly limited. But as I gave an example of one of the things we did this summer for the climate agreement, where there was a lot of talk about power to heat. There you see that we also implemented already some changes in our model. I guess I listed a couple of major elements we have to change. It's something we have to do in the coming years in order to be able to be up to date. And maybe to add to that, as I said, I focused on 230. We sometimes do studies on 250, and then we use sometimes a different model. We have what we call the system integration model of the Dutch energy system called OPERA, which includes all sectors in an integrated way. And with that, we can really look in a very good way at system integration aspects. And we also link that model with our European electricity market model in order to get a better view of reactions over the border with other countries within the EU. And that really gives you a good picture of the longer future of the energy system and how it might develop, taking into account all the interactions between the different parts of it. But elements of that approach will have to be included in this modeling suite we use for the national energy output.
Okay, thanks very much. So one last question on the screen at the moment, unless anybody else posts anything else. So applied model suites and utilized data are often very comprehensive. How do you trade off level of details and readability in your documentation?
Yeah, I think that the National Energy Outlook is well, it's quite a publication. There's I don't know, a couple of hundred of words, more than around 200 pages. What we try to do is to give a more of an overview in the first chapters, which is concise but still includes enough detail for people who are not specifically interested in specific sectors. And we have more detailed chapters on the different sectors. In addition to that, we provide separate from the publication a set of tables, which give even more detailed information and outcomes for a whole lot of indicators. And we have something called Onipad, in which we have a web-based application, which people can use to get even more detailed results. But that's more focused on researchers, people practicing in the field, and that's undergoing some revisions. So we basically had to summarize. We provide data and information at different levels, both within the publication, on a more general and more specific, and in other ways to give much more detail to those who are interested.
Good, thank you. That seems like a good answer. So that is all the questions that are posted online. I will just pause for a second just to see if anybody else wants to post anything extra. Otherwise, we will be done for today. Just pausing to see if there's any extra questions appear. Sometimes there's a slight lag. No, looks like that covers it. Well, thank you very much to both our speakers. I think Hiroyuki has left us, but Paul, thank you very much for your time and for the very clear presentation. Thank you everybody for your questions. So that's the end of the series for 2018, but it continues in 2019. So our next session is on January the 17th. That's at 16:30 Central European time. And there we will have two presenters from the Energy Technology Systems Analysis Program, which I think many of you are familiar with. George Giankidis will talk about building capacity, and Brian O'Gallagher will talk about the program as a whole. So do join us for that one, and then there'll be more that follow immediately afterwards. Once again, thank you very much for your time. I wish you all the very best for the holiday season if you're celebrating that, and we'll see you again in 2019. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.